The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of the dusty mercantile in Centralia, Kansas, and Delilah Kinsley stepped down onto soil that felt as foreign as the moon. Her worn leather gloves the only familiar comfort in this strange new world she just entered on this scorching afternoon in July of 1874. She clutched her single carpetbag close to her chest, feeling the eyes of every person on the street turn toward her with undisguised curiosity. The advertisement had been clear enough in the Boston newspaper. Rancher seeks wife. Must be hardworking, honest, and willing to face frontier life. She'd responded with a letter that told only half-truths, painting herself as capable when really she was desperate, fleeing a brother-in-law who'd made it clear she'd worn out her welcome after her sister's death from consumption 6 months prior. The Kansas heat hit her like a physical wall after the relative coolness of the stagecoach, and she could feel sweat already beginning to dampen the high collar of her traveling dress. The fabric was dark blue, serviceable rather than fashionable, with only a few patches that she tried to hide with careful stitching. Everything she owned in the world fit into that single bag, and even that was half empty. "Miss Kinsley." The voice came from behind her, deep and uncertain. She turned to find a man standing perhaps 10 feet away, hat in his hands, sandy brown hair ruffled by the hot wind that kicked up little devils of dust along the street. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard work and a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so weathered by sun and wind. His eyes were an unexpected shade of green, like new grass after spring rain, and they studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Yes," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Mr. Yates Larkin, I presume?" He nodded slowly, taking a few steps closer. His gaze traveled from her face down to her hands, still clutching the carpetbag, and she saw his eyes linger on the gloves. They were buffalo leather, once fine but now cracked and worn at the fingertips, stained with heaven knew what from 3 years of doing her sister's washing and mending, and all the other work that had kept them fed after her husband had died in a factory accident. "Just Yates is fine," he said. "Welcome to Centralia." She wanted to say something clever or charming to make a good first impression, but her throat felt full of the dust from 2 weeks of travel. Instead, she just nodded. He seemed to understand, stepping forward and reaching for her bag. "Let me take that for you." "My wagon's just over there. I thought we might stop at the restaurant for some supper before we head out to the ranch. Give you a chance to rest a bit from the journey." "That would be kind, thank you." She released the bag to him, and as he took it, his hand accidentally brushed against hers. Even through the worn glove, she felt the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. They walked side by side toward a wagon that had seen better days but appeared sturdy enough. He helped her up onto the seat with a gentleness that surprised her, given his size, and then climbed up beside her. The leather creaked under his weight. "The ranch is about an hour's ride from town," he said as he took up the reins. "Not too far, but far enough that we don't get into town more than once a week or so. I hope that won't be too much of a hardship." "I'm sure I'll manage." She folded her hands in her lap, acutely aware of how close they were sitting. The wagon seat wasn't large, and his shoulder was mere inches from hers. They rode in silence to the restaurant, a simple wooden building with a painted sign that declared it to be Martha's Eatery. Inside, it was blessedly cooler, with windows open to catch any breeze. Only a few other diners occupied the tables, and they all looked up with interest as Yates led her to a corner table. "Yates Larkin, as I live and breathe," said a plump woman with graying hair who emerged from the kitchen. "And this must be your bride-to-be. Welcome, dear. I'm Martha Prout. I've known this boy since he first came to Kansas 5 years back." "Thank you," Delilah said, managing a small smile. "I'm Delilah Kinsley." "Well, aren't you pretty as a picture? Yates, you didn't tell me she'd be so lovely." Delilah felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature, and she saw that Yates was looking decidedly uncomfortable as well, his ears turning red. "Martha," he said, a note of warning in his voice. "Oh, hush, I'll bring you both the stew. It's good today, I promise." She bustled away, leaving them alone at the table. "I apologize for her," Yates said quietly. "She means well, but she's got no filter between her brain and her mouth. It's all right." Delilah carefully pulled off her gloves, finger by finger, and set them on the table beside her. Her hands were pale from being covered, but the knuckles were slightly swollen, and there were small scars here and there from needles and kitchen accidents, and the general wear of hard work. She saw Yates looking at them again, and she fought the urge to hide them away. In Boston, ladies kept their hands soft and smooth. Out here, she suspected such vanity was a luxury few could afford. "You've worked hard," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes." She met his eyes, refusing to be ashamed. "My sister married young, and her husband died 3 years ago. I kept house for her and her 2 children until she passed this winter. Her husband's brother took in the children, but he made it clear there wasn't room for me as well. I'm sorry." The sympathy in his voice sounded genuine. "That must have been difficult." "Life is difficult," she said simply. "One manages or one doesn't. I chose to manage." Martha returned with 2 steaming bowls of stew and thick slices of bread still warm from the oven. The smell alone made Delilah's mouth water. She'd eaten sparingly on the journey, trying to make her limited funds stretch as far as possible. They ate in a silence that was surprisingly comfortable. The stew was rich with beef and vegetables, and Delilah had to force herself to eat slowly, to show some semblance of manners even though she was ravenous. "My ranch isn't fancy," Yates said after a while, setting down his spoon. "It's about 300 acres with maybe 50 head of cattle right now. I've got 2 horses, some chickens, and a milk cow. The house is small but solid. 2 rooms downstairs, a loft upstairs. I built it myself when I first claimed the land." "It sounds fine," she said honestly. Anything would be better than the cramped, cold room she'd been relegated to in her brother-in-law's house, sleeping on a pallet by the kitchen stove. "I should be honest with you about something." He looked down at his hands, clasped on the table. "I'm not a rich man. I make enough to get by, to save a little here and there, but there won't be fancy dresses or jewelry or any of the things a woman might want." "Mr. Larkin, Yates," she corrected when he looked up. "I didn't come here expecting riches. I came here because I needed a home and you needed a wife. I can cook and clean and mend. I can tend a garden and care for chickens. I'm stronger than I look, and I'm not afraid of hard work. If you're worried I'll be disappointed by modest circumstances, you can set your mind at ease." Something shifted in his expression, a tension she hadn't even realized he was carrying seeming to ease from his shoulders. "That's good to hear. Real good." They finished their meal, and Yates insisted on paying despite Martha's protests that the meal should be a wedding gift. As they walked back out into the late afternoon heat, Delilah realized with a start that she would be expected to marry this man, this stranger, very soon. Tomorrow perhaps, or even tonight if there was a preacher available. As if reading her thoughts, Yates said, "I thought we might wait a few days before we make things official. Give you time to settle in, to be sure this is what you want. I won't hold you to anything if you decide I'm not what you expected." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by suspicion. "That's very generous, but what about propriety? Won't people talk if we're living under the same roof unwed? The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away," he said with the hint of a smile. "And I'll sleep in the barn until we're married proper. Your reputation will stay intact." They climbed back into the wagon, and he turned the horses toward the open prairie that stretched beyond the town. The land was vast and flat, broken only by occasional stands of trees near water sources and the endless waving grass that turned golden in the slanting sunlight. It was beautiful in a way that made Delilah's chest ache. So much space, so much sky. "It's overwhelming at first," Yates said, noticing her expression. "All this emptiness. But you get used to it, start to crave it even. When I go into town now, all those buildings feel like they're closing in on me." "I can understand that," she said softly. "In Boston, everything was crowded. Buildings pressed right up against each other, people everywhere. Sometimes I felt like I couldn't breathe." They talked as the wagon rolled along the rutted road, sharing small pieces of themselves. She learned that he was 28, that he'd come from Ohio with dreams of building something of his own, that his parents had died of fever when he was 17, and he'd worked odd jobs for years before saving enough to file a homestead claim. He learned that she was 24, that she'd never expected to leave Boston, that she loved reading but hadn't owned a book of her own in years, that she missed the ocean even though she'd only seen it a handful of times. The sun was touching the horizon when a small house came into view, nestled in a slight depression near a creek lined with cottonwood trees. It was built of sod and wood, with a shingled roof and a covered porch that ran along the front. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Delilah could see a vegetable garden fenced in behind the house, along with a chicken coop and a barn that looked newer than the house itself. "Home," Yates said simply. He helped her down from the wagon, and she stood for a moment just looking around. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, carrying the scent of grass and earth and the promise of rain on the distant horizon. She could hear the creek burbling and the chirping of crickets beginning their evening song. "I started a fire in the stove before I left this morning," Yates said, leading her toward the house. "Thought you might want something hot to drink when we arrived." The interior of the house was dim and cool, the walls thick enough to keep out the worst of the heat. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a cast iron stove, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fireplace, and open shelves that held dishes and supplies. Everything was clean but sparse, the home of a man who lived alone and saw no need for decoration. A doorway led to what she assumed was the bedroom, and a ladder against one wall climbed to the loft above. It was small, yes, but it was more than she dared hope for. "I'll show you where everything is," Yates said, setting her carpetbag down near the table. "The well is just outside the back door. Water's good and cold, even in summer. There's a root cellar for keeping things cool, and the privy is behind the barn." He walked her through the space, pointing out where he kept the flour and cornmeal, the salt pork and dried beans. The coffee that he admitted was his one real extravagance. His bedroom, glimpsed through the doorway, held only a bed with a simple quilt, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. It was neat as a pin, almost military in its order. "You'll sleep here," he said, not meeting her eyes. "I'll take my bedroll to the barn like I said. No need for you to feel uncomfortable. Thank you." She was grateful, truly, for his consideration. She'd been prepared for much worse. The stories other women had whispered about mail-order marriages had been filled with warnings about men who were brutes or drunkards or worse. Yates heated water for coffee, and they sat at the table, the conversation flowing easier now. He told her about his cattle, about the market in Kansas City, where he'd driven them last fall, about his plans to expand the herd if he could. She told him about her nephews, about how much she missed them, about the garden she'd kept in a tiny plot behind her sister's house. When full darkness had fallen and the coffee was long gone, he finally stood. "I should let you get some rest. It's been a long day for you." "Yes." She stood as well, suddenly uncertain. "Thank you, Yates, for being kind, for being patient." He looked at her for a long moment, his green eyes serious. "I want you to be happy here, Delilah. I know that might seem like a strange thing to say when we barely know each other, but it's true. I didn't send for a wife because I wanted a servant. I sent for a wife because this land is beautiful, but it's lonely, and I thought maybe we could build something good together." Her throat felt tight. "I'd like that." He nodded, grabbed his bedroll from the loft, and headed for the door. He paused on the threshold, looking back. "If you need anything in the night, anything at all, just ring the bell on the porch. I'll hear it." Then he was gone, and she was alone in the house that might become her home. She changed into her nightgown, washed her face in the basin, and climbed into the bed. The mattress was stuffed with straw, but it was comfortable enough, and the quilt smelled of sunshine and soap. She should have been exhausted, but sleep was elusive. Her mind kept replaying the day, from that first moment of seeing Yates standing in the street with his hat in his hands, to the unexpected gentleness in his rough fingers when he'd helped her from the wagon, to the way he'd looked at her hands without judgment. Strong hands, she'd told him when he'd asked about the scars. He'd nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant. The next morning, she woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and light streaming through the single window. For a moment, she was disoriented, and then memory flooded back. Kansas. The ranch. Yates. She dressed quickly in her oldest work dress, braided her dark hair, and went to investigate the kitchen. Someone, Yates presumably, had already stoked the fire in the stove, and there was fresh water in the bucket by the basin. She found a pan and some eggs and set about making breakfast. She was just setting the table when the door opened and Yates came in, carrying a pail of milk. He stopped short when he saw her at the stove. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know. I wanted to." "You've been doing everything yourself for too long, I think." He smiled, really smiled, and it transformed his face. "That's the truth. Thank you." They ate together, and then he asked if she'd like to see the rest of the property. She agreed eagerly, pulling on her worn gloves before following him outside. The morning was already warm but not yet oppressive, and the sky was a blue so clear and bright it hurt to look at. He showed her the chickens, about a dozen hens and one proud rooster. He showed her the milk cow, a gentle creature named Bessie who regarded Delilah with liquid brown eyes. He showed her his two horses, a gelding named Rusty and a mare named Star who nuzzled at Delilah's palm looking for treats. "You ride?" he asked. "A little. It's been years, though." "We'll get you back in practice. You'll need to know how, living out here. Sometimes the wagon's too slow or too cumbersome." They walked down to the creek, which was running clear and quick over smooth stones. Cottonwoods provided shade, and she could see why he'd chosen to build here. Water was life in this country. "This is all yours?" she asked, gesturing at the land around them. 300 acres, every inch. I proved up on my claim 2 years ago. It's mine, free and clear now, no debt on it." There was pride in his voice, and rightly so. She knew how hard it must have been to survive the required 5 years of homesteading, to make the improvements to the land that the government demanded. They walked together through the waving grass, and he pointed out landmarks, the stand of trees to the north where he sometimes hunted deer, the slight rise to the east that gave a view for miles, the area he was planning to fence for a larger pasture. His hands moved as he talked, painting pictures in the air, and she found herself watching those hands as much as the land he described. They were strong hands, scarred and calloused from years of hard work. Capable hands, honest hands. When they returned to the house near midday, She insisted on making dinner while he went to check on some fence that needed mending. She found potatoes in the root cellar, some of the salt pork, and dried beans that she set to soaking for the next day. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling, and he ate with obvious appreciation. "You're a good cook," he said. "My sister taught me. She was better at it than I am, but I learned enough to get by." This is better than getting by. This is good. The days developed a rhythm. He worked the ranch, and she worked the house and garden. She gathered eggs, fed the chickens, milked the cow once she'd relearned the skill. She weeded the garden and watered it from the creek. She washed clothes in a big tub and hung them to dry in the constant wind. She mended his shirts and her own dresses, taking satisfaction in making neat, nearly invisible stitches. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk. He told her about his childhood in Ohio, about his mother who'd loved to sing and his father who'd been a blacksmith. She told him about Boston, about her parents who died when she was young, about growing up in her older sister's household, always feeling like a burden even though her sister had never once made her feel unwelcome. On the fourth day, he came in from the barn with something in his hands. "I made these for you," he said, almost shyly. "Well, I'm making them. They're not quite finished yet." He held out a pair of gloves, leather like her old ones but new, unstained, the stitching careful and even. They were exactly the right size, and she realized he must have studied her old gloves carefully to get the measurements right. "Yates," she breathed, running her fingers over the soft leather. "These are beautiful. You made these." "My father taught me leatherwork before he died. I don't do much of it anymore, but I remember enough. Your old ones are about to fall apart, and I thought you might need new ones." She looked up at him, this tall rancher with the gentle green eyes, and felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. Trust, maybe. Affection. The sense that she might actually be safe here, valued here. "Thank you," she said. "This is the kindest gift anyone has ever given me." He ducked his head, clearly embarrassed. "It's just gloves." "No," she said firmly. "It's not just gloves. It's you paying attention. It's you caring. That matters." That evening, after supper, he asked the question she'd been half expecting. "I was thinking we might go into town this Sunday, talk to the preacher if you're ready. If you've decided you want to stay." She'd been sitting in the rocking chair, mending one of his shirts by lamplight. She set down the needle and looked at him across the room, where he sat at the table oiling a piece of tack. "I want to stay," she said quietly. "If you're sure you want me to." He set down the tack and oil, stood and crossed to her. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, but instead he reached for her hands, still covered by the worn gloves she'd been wearing all day. Slowly, gently, he removed them, setting them aside. Then he took her bare hands in his, turning them over to look at her palms, her work-roughened fingers, her scarred knuckles. "These are strong hands," he said, his voice low and serious. "The hands of someone who doesn't give up, who does what needs doing. I admire that. I admire you." Her breath caught. "Yates, I know we haven't known each other long," he continued, "but I think we could make a good life together, Delilah. I think we could be happy. Not right away, maybe, but in time, if you're willing to try." "I am," she whispered. "I want to try." He raised one of her hands to his lips and kissed it, not the back of her hand like a gentleman courting a lady, but her palm, her work-worn palm. The gesture was so tender, so intimate, that she felt tears prick her eyes. "Then we'll go to town on Sunday and make it official," he said. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and he released her hands. But that night, when she went to bed, she could still feel the warmth of his lips against her palm. Sunday dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for a wedding, even if it would be a simple affair. Delilah had washed and pressed her best dress, a gray cotton with a white collar that she'd sewn herself. It wasn't what most brides wore, but it would have to do. She braided her hair and pinned it up, studied herself in the small mirror above the washstand, and tried to calm the butterflies in her stomach. Yates had gone to the barn to harness the horses to the wagon, and she could hear him moving around outside. She took a deep breath, pulled on her new gloves that he'd finished the night before, and went to meet her future. He was standing by the wagon when she emerged, wearing what were clearly his best clothes: dark trousers, a white shirt, a vest, and a string tie. His hair was neatly combed, still damp from washing, and he'd shaved carefully. When he saw her, his eyes widened. "You look beautiful," he said. "Thank you. You look very handsome." The ride into town felt simultaneously endless and far too short. They didn't talk much, both lost in their own thoughts. Delilah's hands were folded in her lap, and she was acutely aware of every jolt of the wagon, every moment that brought her closer to becoming Mrs. Yates Larkin. The church in Centralia was a simple white building with a tall steeple, sitting at the edge of town near a grove of trees. The preacher, a middle-aged man named Reverend Thomas, greeted them warmly. He'd clearly been expecting them, and Delilah suspected Yates had made arrangements earlier in the week. "Welcome, welcome," he said. "Do you have witnesses? We'll need at least 2. "Martha said she'd come," Yates said, "and I asked Samuel Brennan, the man who runs the feed store. They should be here soon." Indeed, within minutes, both Martha and a tall, thin man with spectacles arrived. Martha was dressed in her Sunday best and practically vibrating with excitement. Samuel was more reserved but offered Delilah a kind smile and a nod of welcome. The ceremony was brief and simple. Reverend Thomas spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about commitment and partnership and building a life together. He asked if Yates took Delilah as his wife, to honor and cherish her, and Yates answered, "I do," his voice clear and steady. He asked if Delilah took Yates as her husband, to honor and cherish him, and she managed to say, "I do," though her voice shook slightly. "Do you have a ring?" the Reverend asked. Yates reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. It wasn't new, and Delilah suspected it had belonged to his mother. He took her left hand, removed the glove, and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride." Yates looked at her, a question in his eyes, asking permission. She gave the tiniest nod, and he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle, chaste, the kiss of a man who was still learning to know his wife. But it was real, and it sealed something between them. When they pulled apart, Martha was crying happy tears, and even Samuel was smiling. They signed the register, making it official in the eyes of the law as well as God, and then they were walking back out into the sunshine, married. Martha insisted they come to her restaurant for a wedding dinner, refusing to take no for an answer. She'd prepared a feast: roasted chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, vegetables from her garden, and a cake that she admitted she'd been planning since the day Yates had told her his bride was arriving. "I knew you were a good one the moment I saw you," Martha said to Delilah, patting her hand. "Yates deserves someone good. He's had a hard time of it building that ranch all alone. Now he's got you to help him, and I bet in a year or 2 there will be little ones running around that place." Delilah felt her cheeks heat, but Yates just laughed. "Martha, you're incorrigible." "Someone has to be," Martha said with a wink. They ate and talked, and for the first time since leaving Boston, Delilah felt like she might actually have a community here, people who would become friends. Samuel talked about the growth of the town, about new families moving in, about plans for a school if they could get enough children in the area. Martha told stories about the early days of Centralia, when it had been little more than a few tents and a dream. As the afternoon wore on, Yates finally stood. "We should be getting back. The animals need tending." They thanked Martha and Samuel for being part of their day, and then they were in the wagon again, heading home. Except now it wasn't just Yates's home. It was their home. Delilah was Mrs. Larkin now, for better or worse. The sun was setting as they approached the house, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Yates helped her down from the wagon, and this time when his hands circled her waist, they lingered a moment longer than necessary. "I'll take care of the horses," he said. "You go on inside." She nodded and went into the house, lighting the lamps, stirring the fire back to life in the stove. Her hands were shaking slightly. She was married now, truly married. And tonight, well, tonight would be their wedding night. She heard him come in, the sound of him washing up at the basin. Then his footsteps crossing the room, stopping behind her where she stood at the stove pretending to be busy with nothing. "Delilah," he said softly. She turned to face him, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. There was desire there, yes, but also tenderness and something that might have been uncertainty. "I know this is all very fast," he said. "And I know we're married now, which means there are certain expectations. But I want you to know that I won't rush you. We can take this as slow as you need." She studied him, this good man who'd given her a home and his name and was now offering her patience as well. "I'm nervous," she admitted, "but I'm not unwilling. You've been nothing but kind to me, Yates. I trust you." Something in his eyes flared at her words, and he stepped closer, reaching up to cup her face with his hands. "I'll be gentle," he promised. "I'll do my best to make this good for you." Then he was kissing her again, but this time it wasn't the chaste kiss of the ceremony. This was deeper, fuller, speaking of want and need and the promise of things to come. She kissed him back, rising on her toes to meet him, her hands clutching at his shirt. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he took her hand and led her to the bedroom, closing the door behind them. The next morning, Delilah woke wrapped in her husband's arms, the sunlight streaming through the window warming the quilts. She felt different, changed in some fundamental way. Her body ached in unfamiliar places, but it wasn't unpleasant. Yates had been true to his word, gentle and patient, making sure she found pleasure even in her nervousness. She shifted slightly, and his arms tightened around her. "Morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning." He opened his eyes and looked at her, and she saw contentment there. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I didn't hurt you." "No, I'm fine. Better than fine." He smiled and kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips. "Good, because I was hoping we might do that again sometime soon." She laughed, swatting at his chest. "You're incorrigible. Martha's rubbing off on me." They stayed in bed longer than they should have, talking and learning each other's bodies, building the foundation of their physical relationship. Eventually, though, the animals demanded attention, and they had to get up. The days that followed developed a new rhythm. They worked side by side more often now, him teaching her to handle the cattle, her showing him tricks for making the garden more productive. In the evenings, they would sit close on the porch, his arm around her shoulders, watching the sunset paint the prairie in impossible colors. And at night, they came together in their bed, learning what pleased each other, growing bolder and more confident. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was good and getting better. 3 weeks after their wedding, they were eating breakfast when Yates suddenly reached across the table and took her hand. "I need to tell you something," he said. Her heart lurched. "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with you, Delilah. I know it's only been a short while, but I can't help it. You're everything I hoped for and more. You're strong and capable and kind, and when I think about the future now, I can't imagine it without you." Tears sprang to her eyes. "Oh, Yates. I'm falling in love with you too. I didn't expect it to happen so fast, but it has. You make me feel safe and valued and cherished." He stood, pulling her up into his arms and kissed her deeply. "I will cherish you," he promised against her lips, "every day for the rest of our lives." As summer turned to fall, they settled more deeply into their life together. She learned to ride well enough that she could accompany him when he checked the cattle. They made trips to town together, and she began to make friends with some of the other women in the area. Martha became a regular part of their lives, often joining them for Sunday dinner after church. The harvest from the garden was good, and Delilah spent long days canning and preserving, filling the root cellar with jars that would see them through the winter. Yates managed to buy 10 more head of cattle from a rancher who was moving back east, expanding his herd. In October, Delilah realized her monthly courses hadn't come. She waited another week to be sure, and then another, before she finally told Yates one evening as they were getting ready for bed. "I think I might be pregnant," she said, the words coming out in a rush. He went very still, his shirt halfway unbuttoned. "You think or you know?" "I'm 3 weeks late, and I'm never late, and I've been feeling sick in the mornings, though I didn't want to say anything until I was more certain." He crossed to her in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms. "A baby," he breathed. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" she asked, pulling back to see his face. "Happy, Delilah, I'm beyond happy. I'm thrilled. Terrified but thrilled." She laughed, relief flooding through her. "Good. Me too." They made love that night with a tenderness that was almost reverent, both of them aware that there were now 3 hearts beating in that room instead of 2. As fall deepened into winter, Delilah's pregnancy became more obvious. Her dresses had to be let out, and Yates took to treating her like she was made of glass, constantly trying to keep her from doing anything strenuous. "I'm pregnant, not an invalid," she finally told him in exasperation when he tried to stop her from gathering eggs. "I can still do my work." "I just worry," he said. "What if something happens? What if you fall or strain yourself or—" She kissed him, cutting off his words. "I'll be careful, I promise. But you have to let me live my life." The winter was hard, as Kansas winters tended to be. There were weeks when they were snowed in, when the world outside seemed to disappear in a blanket of white. But the house was warm and well-stocked, and they had each other. During the long dark evenings, Yates would read to her from the few books he owned, or they would play cards or simply sit by the fire and talk. He told her every dream he'd ever had for the ranch, and she shared her hopes for their child, for the life they were building together. In February, during a brief warm spell, Yates insisted they go into town. "I want you to see the doctor," he said, "just to make sure everything's all right with you and the baby." The doctor, an older man named Dr. Harrison, who'd moved to Centralia the previous year, examined her thoroughly and pronounced both mother and child healthy. "I'd say you're due sometime in early May," he said. "Another 3 months or so. Make sure you're getting enough rest and send for me when your time comes." On the way home, Yates drove the wagon more carefully than ever, avoiding every rut and bump. Delilah smiled at his protectiveness, even as it exasperated her. "I love you," she said suddenly. He looked at her in surprise. "I love you too. What brought that on?" "Just everything. The way you care for me. The way you worry, even when it drives me a bit mad. The life we're building. I never thought I'd be this happy, Yates. When I left Boston, I was so scared. I thought I was choosing the lesser of 2 evils, going to marry a stranger rather than stay where I wasn't wanted. But instead I found you, I found home." He pulled the wagon to a stop right there in the middle of the road and kissed her, long and deep and full of promise. "You are my home too," he said when they finally parted. "You and this baby. You're everything that matters." March came in like a lion, with howling winds and late snow. But by the end of the month, the snow was melting and the first green shoots were pushing up through the earth. Delilah, now heavily pregnant and moving slowly, began planning her garden for the coming season. Yates had been working on a surprise, something he'd kept hidden in the barn for weeks. Finally, on a warm day in early April, he asked her to come with him. "Close your eyes," he said as they approached the barn. "Yates, what are you up to? Just close your eyes and trust me." She did, letting him guide her into the barn's dimness. She heard him moving something, and then he said, "All right, you can look." She opened her eyes to find a beautiful wooden cradle, clearly handmade, the wood sanded smooth and polished until it glowed in the light. It was simple but perfect, with high sides and rockers that would let it sway gently. "Oh, Yates," she breathed, moving closer to run her hands over it. "This is beautiful. You made this. I've been working on it every spare moment for the past 2 months. I wanted our baby to have something special, something that would last, something we could pass down to our grandchildren someday." She turned to him with tears streaming down her face. "It's perfect. You're perfect. I love you so much." They stood together in the barn, his arms around her and her swollen belly pressing against him, and marveled at the life they'd created together in such a short time. 2 weeks later, on a night when the moon was full and bright, Delilah woke to a sharp pain in her belly. At first she thought it was nothing, just the baby shifting position as it so often did. But then it came again, stronger, and she knew. "Yates," she said, shaking his shoulder. "Yates, wake up, the baby's coming." He was awake in an instant, his eyes wide. "Now, but it's too soon." "The doctor said May. Babies come when they're ready, not when it's convenient. You need to go get Dr. Harrison." He dressed faster than she'd ever seen anyone dress, his hands shaking as he pulled on his boots. "Will you be all right alone? Should I get Martha first? She's closer." "Yes, get Martha, then the doctor. Hurry." He kissed her hard and fast, then was gone, and she heard him riding away at a gallop. She made her way to the kitchen, breathing through the pains that were coming more regularly now, and set water to boil because she thought that was what you were supposed to do. Martha arrived first, riding astride one of the horses from the livery stable, her hair flying loose. "I'm here, honey," she said, bursting through the door. "Yates came pounding on my door fit to wake the dead. Let's get you comfortable." She helped Delilah back to the bedroom, got her into a clean nightgown, and began preparing the bed with extra linens. The pains were coming harder and faster now, and Delilah gripped Martha's hand through each one. "That's it," Martha coached. "You're doing fine. Just breathe through it." Dr. Harrison arrived about an hour later, Yates on his heels looking pale and terrified. The doctor examined Delilah and pronounced that things were progressing normally, though it would likely be several more hours. "You can stay," Dr. Harrison told Yates, "but you'll have to promise not to faint on me. I've got my hands full with your wife." "I won't faint," Yates said, moving to Delilah's side and taking her hand. "I'm not leaving her." The hours that followed were the longest of Delilah's life. The pain was worse than anything she'd imagined, wave after wave of it crashing over her until she thought she might drown. But Yates never left her side, letting her squeeze his hand until his fingers went white, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement. "You're so strong," he told her over and over. "The strongest person I know. You can do this." Finally, as dawn was breaking, Dr. Harrison said, "All right, Mrs. Larkin, with the next pain I need you to push." She bore down with everything she had, crying out with the effort. Again and again, until she thought she had nothing left to give. And then suddenly there was a release, a feeling of emptiness, and the room was filled with the sound of a baby crying. "It's a boy," Dr. Harrison announced, holding up a small, squirming bundle. "A healthy baby boy." Delilah collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted beyond measure. Yates was crying, she realized, tears streaming down his face as he looked at their son. Martha took the baby and cleaned him up while the doctor tended to Delilah. Then Martha was placing the baby in Delilah's arms, and she looked down at the tiny, perfect face of her son. He had a cap of dark hair like hers, and when he opened his eyes briefly, she saw they were blue, though she knew they might change. His little fists waved in the air, and his mouth worked as if he was already looking to nurse. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." Yates leaned in close, one arm around Delilah and one finger gently touching the baby's tiny hand. The baby's fist closed around his finger, and Yates made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "He's perfect," Yates said. "You're perfect, both of you." "Have you thought of a name?" Martha asked. Delilah looked at Yates. They discussed names but never settled on anything definite. "What do you think?" she asked him. "I'd like to name him Thomas," Yates said slowly. "After my father, Thomas Larkin, if that's all right with you." "Thomas," she repeated, trying it out. "Yes, I like that." "Thomas Yates Larkin." "Thomas Yates," Yates echoed, his voice full of wonder. Dr. Harrison and Martha left a few hours later after making sure both mother and baby were doing well. Martha promised to spread the word in town, and the doctor said he'd check back in a few days. Then it was just the three of them, Yates and Delilah and baby Thomas, together in their small house as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Yates brought the cradle from the barn and placed it beside their bed. When Thomas finally fell asleep after nursing, they laid him in it gently, watching him in awe. "We made that," Yates whispered. "That perfect little person. We made him together." "We did," Delilah agreed, leaning against her husband's side. "And we'll raise him together here on this land. We'll teach him to be good and strong and kind, just like his father. And brave and capable like his mother," Yates added. They stood together, watching their son sleep, and Delilah marveled at how much her life had changed in less than a year. She'd arrived in Centralia scared and desperate, with nothing but a worn pair of gloves and a carpetbag to her name. Now she had a husband she loved, a beautiful son, and a home that was truly hers. The first few weeks with a newborn were exhausting. Thomas needed to nurse every few hours, day and night, and Delilah felt like she was walking through a fog of sleeplessness. But Yates helped as much as he could, taking the baby in the early mornings so she could sleep a bit longer, rocking him when he was fussy, changing his soiled cloths without complaint. "I never knew I could love something so much so quickly," Yates confessed one night as he held Thomas against his chest, walking the floor to soothe him. "I thought what I felt for you was the strongest love I'd ever know, but this is something else entirely." "I know," Delilah said from the rocking chair where she was trying to keep her eyes open. "It's terrifying and wonderful all at once." As spring turned to summer, Thomas grew bigger and more alert. He began to smile, first just gas, and then real smiles that lit up his whole face, especially when he saw his father. Yates was completely smitten, spending every spare moment playing with his son, talking to him about the ranch and the cattle and everything they'd do together when Thomas was older. The garden flourished under Delilah's care, even better than the previous year. She'd learned what grew best in Kansas soil, what could withstand the heat and the occasional drought. She and Yates worked side by side when they could, Thomas sleeping in a basket in the shade nearby. In July, they made the trip to town for supplies and to attend church. Thomas was now 3 months old, and this was his first real outing. The women of Centralia clustered around, cooing over him, declaring him the most beautiful baby they'd ever seen. Martha was particularly proud, as if she'd had something to do with his creation. "He looks just like his mama," Martha said. "Same dark hair and fine features, but he's got his daddy's chin, I think." Samuel Brennan came over to congratulate them as well, and Delilah noticed a young woman standing near him, looking shyly at the baby. "This is my niece, Abigail," Samuel said. "She's come to live with me, help out in the store. Abigail, this is Yates and Delilah Larkin and their son Thomas." "Pleased to meet you," Abigail said softly. She looked to be about 19, with auburn hair and freckles across her nose. "Welcome to Centralia," Delilah said warmly. "I hope we'll see more of you. There aren't many women around our age out here." After church, as they were loading their supplies into the wagon, the Reverend Thomas approached them. "I wanted to ask if you'd heard the news," he said. "We finally have enough children in the area that we're going to open a school. We've hired a teacher and she'll be arriving in August." "That's wonderful," Delilah said, thinking of Thomas and the children they might have in the future. "It's good to know there will be education available." On the ride home, Thomas fell asleep to the rocking of the wagon, and Delilah found herself thinking about the future. A school meant the town was growing, becoming more established. That was good for them, good for the ranch. With more people came more opportunities, a bigger market for cattle, more amenities. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, noticing her distant expression. "Just how much has changed since I arrived here. How much I've changed. A year ago I was so scared, coming out here to marry a stranger. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else or being with anyone else. This is home." He reached over and took her hand, lifting it to his lips to kiss her knuckles. The gloves she wore now were the ones he'd made, broken in from months of wear but still sturdy and well made. "I think about that day sometimes," he said. "The day you arrived. How nervous I was. What if you took one look at me and wanted to get back on the stage coach? What if we didn't get along? What if you couldn't handle ranch life? And what if you'd taken one look at me and decided you'd made a terrible mistake?" she countered. "What if you'd seen my worn gloves and old dress and thought I was too poor, too desperate?" "Never," he said firmly. "When I saw those gloves, saw your hands, I knew you were exactly what I needed. Someone who understood hard work. Someone who wouldn't quit when things got tough. I knew it in my bones, Delilah. You were meant to be here with me." "We were meant to be together," she agreed. The summer passed in a blur of work and joy. They added on to the house, building a small room off the main living area that would serve as Thomas's room when he was old enough to sleep on his own. Yates bought more cattle, expanding the herd to 70 head. Delilah's garden produced more than they could use, and she began trading preserves and vegetables in town for other goods. In September, Delilah realized she was pregnant again. They'd talked about wanting more children, about giving Thomas siblings, but she hadn't expected it to happen quite so soon. "Already," Yates said when she told him, but he was smiling. "We're going to have our hands full. At least I know what to expect this time," she said. "Though I'm not looking forward to the birth part again." He pulled her close, careful of Thomas, who was playing on a blanket at their feet. "You'll do fine. You're the strongest person I know, remember." This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she was so busy with Thomas and the ranch that she didn't have time to focus on every little discomfort. The winter was mild, and by the time spring arrived, she was ready to have this baby. In April, when the prairie was covered with wildflowers, she went into labor again. This time the process was faster, and by the time Dr. Harrison arrived, she was already well along. "Looks like this one's in a hurry," the doctor said. He was right. By mid-afternoon, Delilah delivered a daughter, a tiny, perfect little girl with a cap of blonde hair that was clearly going to be the same shade as Yates's. "A girl," Yates breathed, holding his daughter for the first time with wonder on his face. "We have a daughter." They named her Sarah Grace, after Delilah's mother and Yates's mother. Thomas, now almost a year old, was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to touch her soft hair and watch her sleep. With 2 small children, life became even more hectic. But there was so much love in their small house, so much laughter and joy. Yates was an involved father, changing diapers and walking the floor with fussy babies, playing with Thomas while Delilah nursed Sarah. One evening, when Sarah was about 3 months old, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. Thomas was asleep on Yates's shoulder and Sarah was nursing drowsily. "You ever regret it?" Yates asked quietly. "Leaving Boston, coming out here, marrying me?" Delilah looked at him in surprise. "Never, not for a single moment. Why would you ask that? I know this life is hard. The work never ends. The house is small. We don't have much money. I want you to be happy, Delilah. I want you to have everything you deserve." "I have everything I need," she said firmly. "I have you and Thomas and Sarah. I have this ranch, this beautiful land. I have a purpose and work that matters. What more could I want? Fine dresses, maybe. Trips to the city. An easier life." She shifted Sarah to her other breast, then reached out to take Yates's free hand. "Listen to me. I don't want any of that. This life, this is what I want. Working beside you, raising our children together, building something that will last. I love you, Yates Larkin. I love our life. And I wouldn't change a single thing." He squeezed her hand, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I love you too. More than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." The years passed quickly after that, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's green eyes. Sarah was her father's shadow, following him everywhere, insisting on helping with the ranch work even when she was too small to be much actual help. When Thomas was 4 and Sarah was 3, Delilah had twin boys, Samuel and James, named after Samuel Brennan, who'd become a good friend, and James after Yates's middle name. The twins were a handful, identical in every way, and keeping track of which became a family game. The ranch prospered. They now had over 100 head of cattle, and Yates had hired a young man named Peter to help with the work. They'd built a proper bunkhouse for him, and he ate his meals with the family, becoming almost like an older brother to the children. Delilah's garden had expanded to nearly an acre, and she'd become known throughout the area for her preserves and pickles. She traded them in town and even shipped some to Kansas City, bringing in a tidy income that she saved carefully. The house had grown too, with another bedroom added upstairs for the children and a proper parlor built onto the front. It wasn't fancy, but it was comfortable and filled with the sound of children's laughter. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Delilah by taking her to Kansas City for a week, leaving the children in Martha's capable care. They stayed in a hotel, ate in restaurants, and visited shops and theaters. It was exciting and different, but by the end of the week they were both ready to go home. "I miss the prairie," Delilah admitted as they rode the train back. "The quiet, the space, the stars at night. The city is too loud, too crowded." "I felt the same way," Yates said. "Though I'm glad we came. It's good to get away sometimes, to remember that it's just you and me at the heart of everything." When they arrived home, the children rushed to greet them, all talking at once about everything they'd done while their parents were away. Thomas, now 10, had helped Peter with the cattle. Sarah had cooked dinner all by herself, with only a little help from Martha. The twins had gotten into mischief, as twins were prone to do, but nothing too serious. That night, after the children were in bed, Yates and Delilah sat on the porch as they'd done so many times before. The land stretched out before them in the moonlight, peaceful and beautiful. "You remember the day I arrived?" Delilah asked. "When you first saw me getting off that stagecoach?" "Like it was yesterday," Yates said. "You looked so scared and so brave at the same time, and when I saw your gloves, those worn old gloves, I knew." "Knew what?" that you were going to change my life. That you were exactly what I'd been hoping for, even though I hadn't known quite what that was until I saw you. You were real, Delilah. Not some fantasy of a perfect, delicate lady, but a real woman who'd lived and worked and survived. Those gloves told me more about you than any letter ever could. She looked down at her hands, now encased in a newer pair of gloves that Yates had made for her just last year. I was so embarrassed by them. They were so shabby, so worn. I thought you might send me back. Never, he said. Those gloves were beautiful because they showed your strength. And your hands, they were the most beautiful hands I'd ever seen because they told the truth about who you were. She corrected softly. Who I am. I'm still that woman, Yates. I'm still strong. I know. I see it every day. In the way you care for our children, run this household, work in the garden, handle everything that comes our way. You're the strongest person I've ever known. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just being together. 10 years, Delilah thought. 10 years since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, terrified and hopeful. 10 years of hard work and laughter and love. 10 years of building a life together. Thank you, she said finally. For what? For calling my hands strong. For seeing past the worn gloves to the person beneath. For giving me a home and a family and a life I never dreamed I could have. He pulled her close, kissing her temple. I should be thanking you. You took a chance on a lonely rancher with nothing but a dream. You made this house a home. You gave me children and love and purpose. Everything good in my life started the day you arrived. They went inside eventually, checking on the sleeping children before retiring to their own room. As Delilah drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she thought about how strange life was. One decision, one leap of faith, one journey into the unknown, and everything had changed. She'd come to Kansas expecting hardship and duty. Instead, she'd found love and partnership and joy. She'd found a place where her strength was valued, where her worn gloves were a badge of honor rather than shame, where she could be exactly who she was, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The years continued to pass in a steady, comfortable rhythm. Thomas, at 15, was nearly as tall as his father and could do a man's work on the ranch. He had plans to start his own herd, to claim land adjacent to theirs when he came of age. Sarah, at 14, was turning into a beautiful young woman, but she still preferred working with the horses to anything else. The twins, now 11, were inseparable troublemakers who kept everyone on their toes. Delilah, now in her late 30s, had a few threads of silver in her dark hair and lines around her eyes from years of squinting into the prairie sun. But she was still strong, still capable, and when she looked at Yates, now 43 and graying at the temples, she still felt her heart skip a beat. One day in late summer, Yates came into the house looking thoughtful. I was thinking, he said, we should take a trip back to Boston. See if we can find your nephews, the boys your sister raised. Wouldn't you like to see them again? Delilah's breath caught. I haven't seen them in over 15 years. They were just little boys when I left. They'd be grown men now in their 20s. They probably wouldn't even remember me. But wouldn't you like to try? We could afford the trip now. Business has been good. She thought about it for a long moment, then shook her head. No, I appreciate the thought, truly, but Boston isn't my home anymore. I wouldn't even know where to begin looking for them. And the truth is, my life is here now. Our children, the ranch, our friends. This is my family, he nodded, understanding. I just wanted you to know that if you ever wanted to, we could. I know, and I love you for offering, but I have everything I need right here. That fall, Sarah started stepping out with the son of a neighboring rancher, a polite young man named Robert who treated her with respect and made her laugh. Watching her daughter fall in love reminded Delilah of her own courtship with Yates, of those early days of uncertainty that had blossomed into something beautiful. "He better treat her right," Yates grumbled, watching Robert help Sarah into his wagon for a church social. "He will," Delilah said, linking her arm through her husband's. "And if he doesn't, he'll have you to answer to." "Darn right he will." Thomas, meanwhile, had his eye on Abigail Brennan, Samuel's niece who'd come to town all those years ago. She was a teacher at the local school now, and Thomas found excuses to stop by nearly every day. Delilah suspected an engagement announcement wouldn't be far off. The twins were still too young for such things, more interested in horses and hunting and getting into trouble, but Delilah knew their time would come soon enough. Children grew up so fast. One evening, 20 years after Delilah had first arrived in Centralia, she and Yates hosted a gathering at the ranch. Their children were all there, along with their children's sweethearts and friends. Martha came, now quite elderly but still spry and opinionated. Samuel and his wife came, along with Abigail. Peter, who'd worked for them for so many years, came with his new bride. Dr. Harrison was there, and the Reverend Thomas, and half the town it seemed. They set up tables in the yard, and everyone brought food to share. The children ran around playing games while the adults talked and laughed. Yates had his fiddle out, and someone else had brought a guitar, and soon there was music and dancing. Delilah stood on the porch, watching it all, feeling overwhelmed by the goodness of it. This life, this beautiful life they'd built, all these people, this community they were part of. Yates came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking?" "Just that I'm happy. So deeply, completely happy. Look at all this, Yates. Look at what we built. We did good, didn't we? We did. We really did." He turned her to face him, taking both her hands in his. She was wearing the gloves he'd made her all those years ago, finally worn out and replaced multiple times over. These were her newest pair, soft and well-fitting but still practical, still made for work. 20 years ago," he said softly, "you got off a stagecoach with worn gloves and a single bag, and you changed my entire world. You made me believe in love, in family, in the future. You gave me everything I have, everything that matters. I want you to know that I'm just as in love with you today as I was then. More even, because now I know every part of you and it's all beautiful." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I love you too, so much. You gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go. You saw strength in me when I felt so weak. You built a life with me, a family, a legacy. You're the best man I've ever known, Yates Larkin." He kissed her there on the porch in front of God and half the town, kissed her like they were still newlyweds instead of an old married couple. And when they pulled apart, she heard cheering and saw that everyone had stopped to watch, all of them smiling. "Speech," someone called out. Yates laughed but shook his head. "I'm no speechmaker, but I'll say this. Life out here is hard. We all know that. The weather doesn't cooperate, the market's unpredictable, and there's always more work than hours in the day, but it's worth it. Building something with your own hands, raising a family on land you own, being part of a community that looks out for each other, that's what matters. And having someone to share it all with, someone who's your partner in every sense of the word, that makes all the hard parts bearable and all the good parts even better." More cheering, and then Martha was demanding that Delilah say something too. "All right," Delilah said, stepping forward. "When I came here 20 years ago, I didn't know what to expect. I was scared and alone and desperate. But I took a chance, and it was the best decision I ever made. This community welcomed me. This man loved me. This land became my home. I've worked hard, we all have, but I've never regretted it. Not for a single day. So thank you. Thank you for being our friends, for being our family, for making Centralia a place worth living in." The party went on late into the night, full of food and laughter and music. When everyone had finally gone home and the children were in bed, Yates and Delilah cleaned up together, working in the companionable silence of long partnership. "Tired?" he asked as they finished. "Exhausted. But it was a good day. The best." They went to bed, and as Delilah settled against her husband's chest, listening to his heartbeat, she thought about everything that had led her to this moment. Every hardship, every loss, every difficult choice. It had all been leading her here to this man, this life, this home. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what? For holding my hands that first day, for calling them strong, for seeing me." His arms tightened around her. "Always. I'll always see you, Delilah. You're the brightest star in my sky." She fell asleep smiling, safe and warm and loved. The years rolled on, bringing more changes. Thomas married Abigail in a beautiful ceremony at the church, and they settled on the land adjacent to Yates and Delilah's ranch, just as Thomas had planned. Their first child, a son they named Yates after his grandfather, was born a year later. Sarah married Robert, and they moved to his family's ranch 20 miles away. It was far enough that visits required planning, but close enough that they saw each other regularly. Sarah had 2 daughters in quick succession, and both of them inherited their mother's love of horses. The twins, Samuel and James, decided they wanted to see more of the world before settling down. They signed on with a cattle drive heading to Montana, promising to return in a year or 2. Delilah worried about them constantly, but Yates reminded her that boys needed to spread their wings, to have adventures, before they were ready to settle down. As Delilah entered her 50s, her body began to show the years of hard work. Her hands were gnarled with arthritis on cold mornings, and she moved a bit slower than she once had. But she was still active, still running her household and tending her garden, still the strong woman Yates had fallen in love with. Yates, now in his late 50s, had to admit that the work of ranching was getting harder. His back ached more often, and he couldn't work the long hours he once had. They hired more help, and Thomas took over much of the day-to-day operations of the ranch. But they were content, perhaps more so than they'd ever been. With fewer obligations and more help, they had time to simply be together, to enjoy each other's company, to appreciate the life they'd built. On a crisp fall day, Yates suggested they take a ride together, just the 2 of them. They saddled up their horses, older now and gentler, and rode out across the prairie like they'd done so many times before. They rode to the place where they'd first walked together on Delilah's second day at the ranch, to the creek under the cottonwood trees. The trees were taller now, their leaves golden in the autumn sun. They dismounted and sat on the bank, watching the water flow past. "You remember the first time we came here?" Yates asked. "You'd only been here a day, and I was trying to impress you, showing you all around the property like I owned the whole world instead of just 300 acres. I remember. I thought you were so confident, so sure of yourself. I didn't realize you were as nervous as I was." "More nervous, probably. I kept thinking you'd realize you'd made a mistake, that you'd want to leave." "Never," she said, echoing his words from so long ago. "Not for a single moment." He took her hand, removing her glove to look at her bare hand. It was weathered now, marked by age and work, the ring he'd given her worn thin after decades of wear. But it was still beautiful to him, still the hand of the woman he loved. "Strong hands," he said softly. "Just as strong as the day I met you. Maybe stronger because now I know everything they've done, everything they've built." "We built it together," she reminded him. "None of it would have been possible without you. We make a good team. The best." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the play of light on the water, feeling the warmth of the sun and the coolness of the breeze. This land, this beautiful, harsh, unforgiving, generous land, had given them everything. A home, a purpose, a family, a future. "I have no regrets," Delilah said finally. "Not about coming here, not about any of the choices we made. It's been a good life, Yates, a very good life." "It's not over yet," he said with a smile. "We've got years ahead of us still. Grandchildren to spoil, the ranch to watch grow, more sunsets to see." "I know, I'm not saying goodbye, I'm just saying thank you for everything." He kissed her hand, then her forehead, then her lips. "No, thank you, for taking a chance on a lonely rancher. For seeing past the hard work and the isolation to the life we could build together. For being my partner, my love, my everything." They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink and purple. Their home came into view, solid and welcoming, smoke curling from the chimney where Abigail had likely started a fire for supper. As they dismounted and led the horses to the barn, Delilah paused to look back at the house, at the garden, at the land stretching out in all directions. Their land. Their home, their legacy. "What are you thinking?" Yates asked, coming to stand beside her. "Just that I'm grateful for all of this. For you, for the life we built with these strong hands of ours." He linked his fingers with hers, calloused palm against calloused palm, and they stood together in the fading light. Two people who'd taken a chance on each other, who'd worked and loved and built something lasting. Two people who'd found in each other exactly what they needed. "Come on," he said finally. "Let's go inside. I smell Abigail's cooking and I'm starving." She laughed and let him lead her toward the house, toward the warmth and light and love waiting within. Behind them, the prairie stretched endlessly, the same prairie that had witnessed their first uncertain steps together, that had tested them and challenged them and ultimately shaped them into who they were. The mail-order bride with the worn gloves and the rancher who'd called her strong had built something beautiful together. A family, a home, a love that would endure long after they were gone, carried forward by their children and their children's children. And as they stepped through the door into the house filled with the smell of supper and the sound of their grandson's laughter, Delilah knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, exactly where she'd always been meant to be, home. Years continued their steady march forward. Delilah and Yates grew older gracefully, their love deepening with each passing season. The twins eventually returned from Montana, full of stories and ready to settle down. Samuel married a girl from town and took over running the mercantile when the owner retired. James decided ranching was in his blood after all and bought land nearby, starting his own small operation. Grandchildren multiplied, bringing new energy and joy to the ranch. Delilah spent her days teaching them to garden, to cook, to appreciate the land that had given their family so much. Yates took the older ones out with him, teaching them to ride and rope and care for cattle, passing on the knowledge he'd spent decades accumulating. On their 30th wedding anniversary, all their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house that had once seemed so small now overflowed with people, 3 generations of Larkins, plus the friends and community members who'd become like family over the years. Martha, now in her 90s but still sharp as ever, made a toast. 30 years ago, I met a young woman getting off a stagecoach, looking scared but determined. I knew right then she was perfect for Yates, though I didn't say so at the time. Now look at what they've built. A family, a legacy, a love story for the ages. Here's to Delilah and Yates Larkin, and to 30 more years. Everyone raised their glasses, cheering. Delilah looked around the room at all these faces, so many of them bearing traces of her features or Yates's, and felt overwhelming gratitude. That night, after everyone had gone and the house was finally quiet, Delilah and Yates sat on the porch one more time. They were older now, their movements slower, but they still held hands the way they always had. 30 years, Yates said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday you arrived. Other times it feels like you've always been here, like I can't remember life before you. I can't remember wanting to be anywhere else, Delilah said. This is home. This will always be home. They sat in peaceful silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The prairie stretched around them, eternal and unchanging, witness to their love story. You think we'll get another 30? Yates asked softly. I don't know, she admitted. But however long we have, it will be enough. Because we've lived well, loved well, built something that will last beyond us. Our children will carry it forward and their children after them. We'll be remembered not for being perfect, but for being strong. For taking chances and working hard and loving each other through everything. Strong hands, he murmured, lifting hers to his lips once more. The strongest I've ever known. She leaned against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her. And they sat together as they had countless times before, as they would countless times again. Two souls who'd found each other against all odds and built a beautiful life together. The mail-order bride had arrived with worn gloves, scared and desperate and hoping for nothing more than survival. The rancher had held her hands and called them strong, seeing in her not just what she was, but what she could become. Together, they'd proven that love could grow even in the harshest soil, that strength came in many forms, and that the best things in life were worth working for. As the night deepened, and the stars wheeled overhead, Delilah Kinsley Larkin closed her eyes and smiled, content in the knowledge that she'd lived a life full of purpose and love, surrounded by family, grounded in the land she'd learned to call home. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the Kansas prairie, they would rise with it, ready for another day, another adventure, another chance to live and love and be grateful for the life they'd built with their strong, capable, beautiful hands.